All right, so today we bring about the topic of Chekhov's gun.
Yes.
Now, Han, why don't you just give us a little forward here, because some people may not know the backstory and all of what, like the basic principles of what Chekhov's gun is.
So essentially a Russian playwright, author at the end of the 19th century going into the early 20th, and really famous particularly for his short stories. And I think there's actually one, when I always think of Groundhog Day. It's one of the speeches Bill Murray gives toward the end when everyone's watching and listening.
That's such a great moment.
Yeah, and he even says when Chekhov, I forget the line that he says, but when he's giving that speech, that's who he's referring to. And believe it or not, he was actually, majority of his life, he was actually a physician. He actually went to medical school, and he did kind of writing on the side as well, on top of that, of being a physician and a doctor.
I think a lot of the most fascinating writers have had like multifaceted lives with like different areas of expertise.
Oh yeah, and that always it puts me to shame in my own head, because I'm like, man, I can't even do one thing right. I can't do the one thing. This guy's being a doctor on top of it. Yeah, he was actually, there's like a quote. And some of these quotes, I don't know if they could allegedly be attributed to him or not,
Yeah.
He's quoted as saying that he would say, medicine is my lawful wife and literature is my mistress.
Yeah.
So he practiced medicine, but, I guess his passion was more toward writing. And when he grew up, he actually came, I believe, I know he grew up, they were still, in Russia at the time, there was still, serfdom was still legal under the Tsar. And it was hard, almost downright impossible to move out of that class and into, something more profitable. But he actually ended up supporting most of his family as best he could through putting himself through school and selling his writings to like local journals and newspapers. And when he started, it was mostly a lot of sort of comic writing, I guess would be, the best way to describe it, short stories in journals, which garnered him, a lot of popularity. And it wasn't until like a little bit later in life that, he switched to more serious, drama and would get some of the famous, short stories and plays that I think maybe some people have heard of, like The Cherry Orchard is one, The Seagull, Three Sisters, Lady with the Dog. And a lot of what he did focused on making sure that everything that he put in it, wasn't wasted. There was no sense of like fluff going on in the stories compared to other things, especially since he was known for his short stories.
Well, also during this time period, there was a lot of fluff going on, and even Shakespeare was guilty of this to some extent, because a lot of things were pay by page, so everything would pump up, and writers would fill out so much material to just try and get that page count up, and that way they'd get a higher payout.
And if you compare him to like someone else of the time, like Tolstoy, who's like, if you've ever looked at like War and Peace or Anna Karenina or some of his books, they're pretty hefty, and that's not a knock on Tolstoy or anything, but just to show a difference in some of the styles between the two. Chekhov was really interested in like everyday life and like sort of the simple things, especially with his plays later on. There isn't a lot of focus on the overall plot of that you would see in a more traditional story. It was more about the characters in a certain sort of everyday situation, and it was more about the internal struggle and the drama of their inner life that went on inside their own head and their own soul that he tried to focus on. So sometimes you could argue that like if you read it today, you might be like, oh, nothing happens maybe externally or on the surface, but it's all about what the character is thinking and going on. And so that's sort of, I think, to make sure that everything he put there was there for a specific reason, and that eventually evolved into one of the famous lines and quotes. They call it, in storytelling, it's called, Chekhov's gun or Chekhov's dictum.
Which often I've seen people heavily equate it to being a literal weapon.
Yeah.
Which is, it's meant to be taken in the metaphorical sense. And it goes over a lot of people's heads.
Yeah. And I think that's mainly because the quote that he said about it, again, this is allegedly, we're not really sure, or at least not that I have ever come across, if he actually said it or not, or if I don't think he wrote it down. I think it was something more he said and then someone else wrote down. But it was if you say in the first act that there's a rifle hanging on the wall, then in the second or third act, it absolutely must go off.
Great example of the literal is Shaun of the Dead. the
Yes.
Winchester, the rifle.
Yeah,
hanging
yeah.
over the
That
bar.
is literally the quintessential Chekhov gun.
They took it and played it in a literal sense,
Yeah.
and it's one of my favorite jokes from Edgar Wright.
No, yeah, in Shaun of the Dead, that is pretty much that would be the quintessential example in the sense that it takes it literally. And I think, obviously, having seen a lot of their shows and movies, I think they knew what they were doing when they did that,
Oh,
because it's
100%.
literally a rifle hanging on the wall. And I've seen sometimes the quote says, "Oh, it's a pistol." I've seen it change in terms of like how it's said a little bit differently, but it comes down, to the same thing that every story needs to obey its own internal logic. And
I've also seen I've seen characters be personified as the weapon. Also, there's a great story. I'm sure you've seen and heard of the movie Hannah, where this little girl has been programmed to be a literal weapon, almost in like the Bourne Identity sense.
Yeah.
They constantly talk about how powerful she is, and then she finally goes off in the third act and causes all this mayhem. And it's like, okay, this is backed up. This makes sense. Like,
yeah, no, and it's just all going back to that idea of like, if I'm going to put something in there, it almost has like that poetry to it, in that I only have so much space and time to tell a story, so I want to make sure that if I'm setting it up, that I'm paying it off correctly. And that
everything has meaning. It's not just thrown in there for whatever random purpose that makes no sense to an audience.
Yeah. And that's not to say that, again, any type of storytelling has very broad rules. There's no definitive.
And essentially, there are no rules. But
yes,
to navigate and make things more effective, it does help.
You could certainly do whatever you want when it comes to crafting a story.
Exactly.
But you might not get the turnout that you expected.
You get too experimental and you don't play by the rules enough, or you twist the rules in the wrong way, it can put people off.
Yeah. I've always said, like, if you're going to break the rule, make sure you're doing it for the right reason,
Exactly. It has to be for a point.
Yeah. There's got to be a reason. You got to make sure that...
You can't just be contrarian to be contrarian.
Yeah, exactly. Usually then it doesn't come off quite as well. And then sometimes you can always like subvert, the classic subverting of expectations.
That dangerous term.
That gets thrown around a lot. But, you can do that.
People sure do love that one.
Yeah, I've always said, well, for me, anytime when I hear like subvert expectations, I'm just like, well, I feel like any good story should do that in some way. I feel like that's...
Yeah, and I wholeheartly agree. I get put off whenever it's done for the sake of doing it.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah, no, and that's...
If you're intentionally trying to blindside your audience and lead them down an alley to shock and surprise them for amplification of the story's point, then you have something. But there's a lot of just throwing that terminology around just to think you're sounding smart.
And no, and that's, I think that's like, it just calls into, the idea of like making sure that you are setting up and paying off anything of significance, honoring the most powerful images that you give to a reader. Essentially, don't waste their time or your own time with the story.
Make them feel like, not just to make them feel like they've gotten something out of it, but lead them to actually getting something out of it.
And I think that, can sometimes get, a little lost sometimes, especially today. I've noticed, just for me, there are some things that you make the decision, and you can always, like I said, there can always be those things where you throw in as homages to someone else, or just, something that you put in personally for yourself, and that's fine. But I would say the less you set it up, then the less you should expect, your audience or reader to get from it.
Exactly.
There's always that contract you give of any audience or reader as co-creator of whatever art form you're working in.
And that's a great way to put it. It is really a contract. By like setting these things up, your audience is investing their time. They want to know that this is all leading somewhere, that this is going somewhere. And in order to keep them invested and not make them resent you for, taking their time out of in most cases for entertainment's sake, they want to feel that this has all been for something. And to pay that off, you've led them to a place.
Yeah, exactly.
Good, bad, or indifferent, you've taken them somewhere.
Yeah, and it's not so much, how you're going to pay it off. I mean, and that is another thing you want to keep in mind, but it's just the fact that you've given something significance and you have paid it off. And if you decide not to, then it's, there's a lot of times you'll see, I would say sometimes when they don't pay something off, it could be for, comedic effect, or, theme, stating a theme or something.
I think some of my favorite examples are purely just for comedic effect.
Yeah.
And there's like 1,000 great examples, but one of my personal favorites. I'm a big one of my big guilty pleasures is buddy cop movies. I love
Yeah.
just the silly, ridiculous scenarios. But there's a great bit by Chris Tucker in Rush Hour 2 where he goes off on this whole tangent of gambling, and he gets all these wads of cash, and then he gets into a brawl with one of the main antagonists with a samurai sword, and he gets stabbed in the chest.
Yeah.
And it turns out that some of the money that he won at the tables actually saved his life, and he's not just being this crazy, greedy pain in the ass.
Yeah. No, and that's
like, thank you, Benjamin.
And that literally is, the essence of it on, the smallest level.
Yeah, it can just be as simple as just to make you laugh.
Setting up an object and then paying it off, and that's usually what it's equated to. And I will say, sometimes one thing that I had to get used to when I was learning about it is, some people sometimes will confuse it a little bit with foreshadowing.
Yeah, which is easily done because they're quite similar.
Yeah, it's hard to put
and it's not always a clear line between the two.
Yeah,
the two can be the same thing.
It's hard to put like a definite divide. I would say like Chekhov's gun is a type of foreshadowing. I mean, but foreshadowing in and of itself is a little bit less direct, and when you're trying to really go for that surprise factor. Whereas, when you get back to Shaun of the Dead and the rifle on the wall, when it happens, when you have the shot and they're at is it the Winchester, the name of the pub that they go to?
Bar.
I just always know the pub. I can't remember the name. When they show the image, be it conscious or not, you as the audience have essentially been like, okay, you're thinking that's gonna,
you've been seasoned to understand it.
Yeah, and that's gonna come back in some form or manner. Now, if you didn't imagine, like, if that scene at the end didn't have the earlier setup of the rifle, you get more of a surprise factor, but it literally feels like the rifle comes out of nowhere. Now, perhaps Shaun of the Dead can get away with that a little bit more because it is doing it for comedy, but I feel like it would lessen the impact of how they did it the other way, going at, following the rule of Chekhov's gun.
Well, Shaun of the Dead particularly was pretty great at presenting these situations the same in multiple contexts for great effect. So it's like they show how like in the opening scenes of the movie, they show how mundane and zombie-like the general populace is, and how like the apocalypse is very, very relatable to that in these hilarious ways. So it's almost like its comedy pays off in its blandness in a lot of ways, which is what's so funny.
And that's a big thing of like, it's even just like the concept of telling a joke. There's the setup and the punchline.
Yeah.
And I think that's where comedy is so good at specifically this story principle in Chekhov's gun, is that, you got to have the setup, you got to have the payoff. But then if you want people to laugh, there's got to be something funny about it. And that's very subjective for me anyway. There's some people find something funny, others don't. So it makes it, even more challenging, I think, when you do it for comedic reasons. But yeah, it focuses on the smallest level. It focuses on usually some sort of object and giving, the audience and reader notice about it and saying this will come back into play later on. But it doesn't always have to be with a particular object. You can...
Yeah, it can be anything. It can be a social construct. It could be a conversation. It could be an entire character.
Yeah.
Who you thought was erased from existence or gone or what have you.
Yeah, no, I think it definitely stems to something like when he mentioned the idea of, if you have a rifle hanging on the wall, I don't think it was something that he's coined for that phrase, and like the idea of it obviously bears his name, but I don't think it was something that he didn't create. It was there.
He kind of just shone a light on
it. Or at least one of the ones that got his name to stick to it. And I think what he's talking about is essentially is as old as like, storytelling is in and of itself. He's talking about promise that you create, especially in the first act of any story that you write. You are creating this promise, this contract, like I had mentioned before, with whoever is going to read it. Now, if you're obviously there's that question of, well, if I'm just writing for myself, is it then just with myself? That's a possibility. You can write completely for yourself and then finish a story, tuck it away, and then never look at it again. But if you're looking for that interaction with an audience, then definitely this idea of Chekhov's gun or the promise of storytelling, I think, is something that you always want to keep in mind anytime you approach specifically, a movie, TV show, a book that you want to write.
Yeah, I was going to say, because the difference in medium actually takes a lot of effect there in terms of personal investment in actually telling a story, because with filmmaking or video game crafting or board game crafting or any more kind of intensive medium than just simply sitting down and writing for your own purposes, it's just you have more cooks in the kitchen than that, and you have to satisfy these multiple creative visions, and it gets inherently challenging to make a personal story in that regard.
And that's essentially when you brought up video games, that's interesting. That's one reason why I don't like, for me, I still, people still, there's still that debate. Are video games art? Are they not? I would say they are.
Which I find to be a silly debate. And it's tricky because video games really aren't for everyone.
Yeah.
But I think there's some examples out there that kind of ironclad prove the rule.
It's so strange. Like, when I was growing up, I know video games are shown as like, one person solitary experience sitting in a room just playing. And I mean, now you can have tons of people watch you with a camera, and you can stream it live.
Yeah, which has also been an interesting development.
Yeah, so that's certainly changed a little bit. But for me, growing up, believe it or not, I remember, like, when I was little, we had the Sega Genesis, and then we had PlayStation 1, and then the PlayStation 2. We couldn't ever, that was always the thing. There was always, like, multiple competing systems at the time.
Yeah, and then the exclusive titles, so it's like you can't...
And we couldn't...
Oh, man, I can't play that. I'm on PS2. Like...
Yeah, we couldn't afford more than one, so we had to, like, it was almost we had to pick one, so we had to, like... You had to pick your
Coordinate
camp.
with your friends which ones you're getting.
Yeah, exactly. You had to pick your camp, and you had to become a staunch supporter of that. And so we had...
And that's a topic we'll definitely... I want to do
we can
possibly
definitely...
a string of episodes on gaming for sure.
But yeah, we had to, pick which one we wanted. And when I was little, it was Sega Genesis.
But yeah, it really was. It was like you had to commit to your line there.
Yeah. And that was like, and there was always like stories about, oh, this one's better. But anyway, for some weird reason, I don't know why, but like, especially when we would get permission to move the game system out from our bedroom into the living room on the main TV, that was like a big thing. Like, that was like entertainment for the whole week.
Yeah.
And when we would do that, it actually brought my whole family together. It was like one of the weird moments when everyone would like show up either play with us or, just to be like, what the heck is this? Or just like ridicule us and like, tease us about, these games and why we were playing them. So that was always interesting, I thought, video games and how they get that rap for being sort of a solitary experience.
Video games also have a good reputation for being a large time suck.
Oh, yeah.
Because you're unfolding them from a personal experience versus being a passive viewer of like a TV show, movie, what have you.
Yeah.
So you're taking up an active role, and your exploration of the world tends to, I want to use the word dwarf because that's not necessarily correct, but expand beyond the storytelling aspect of what a game can be, so it adds to the time consumption. There's so much to explore in a lot of these worlds, especially games like Destiny or Last of Us or a lot of these huge expansive worlds that you can really truly get lost in.
Yeah, and that essentially, I think one of the reasons that some people sometimes have trouble, or that there is still this debate about video games as art, is it essentially goes back to Chekhov's gun law, is, get rid of anything that doesn't have to be there. Well, from a video game standpoint, it's almost like I encourage the fluff to be there more, because it's about kind of like exploring this open world.
Yeah.
And even though it doesn't necessarily have to be there to support the story, having it there makes, helps with playability, even just from a logistical standpoint. You want to make the game longer, especially if you're charging someone, $60 odd to buy it.
Yeah.
You want to try and like pump as much content into it as you can to get more use out of it. So there's that.
And I think that's why a large degree story-based games have sort of fallen by the wayside, and these big multiplayer experiences have kind of taken over because when you remove the story aspect of it, you're simply dealing with a world you can just get lost in. And story tends to have a limitation to it.
Oh, no, absolutely. Yeah. And I think that's where there was like the term, it's called like ludonarrative dissonance. I forget who coined it, referring to video games and like the disconnect between telling a story and then having the gameplay. And I think that could be one thing that still hasn't been bridged yet. And maybe you can't bridge it. I don't know. But yeah, there is that notion of, I would say, rather than focusing on like a story itself in video games, I would say video games are much more character driven, which is kind of going back to what Chekhov always talked about in his short stories and plays. Is, you know, it wasn't so much about the plot, but it was more about the character of the story and their internal struggles. If you look at that, I mean, a lot of video games that I love are, you know, essentially about the character. Yes, the story and the main plot are there and their place in it, but it all comes down to that character, that person that you control, be it one that the game and the developers have made for you, or one that you can create on your own, you know, be it like an RPG.
Yeah, that's the other interesting aspect, is the crafting of it on your own.
Yeah.
Taking up an active role in the path for this character and where they're going and what they're doing. And while, yes, most games do put you on something of like a bowling lane bumper situation still leading you to the same end, it's like you have control of how exactly you get there. And it creates for a deeper investment, I think, in a lot of regards.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I think so, too.
It really puts you in that driver's seat, and you're making these decisions as much as the character is.
Yeah, and I think that's what's interesting about that. You could argue like that's the promise that, you know, the creators of a video game have with their audience.
That's why I think a lot of people commit to it as a medium too. Like you're looking at YouTubers now who've literally made a career out of investing in some of these characters.
Absolutely, yes, invested in these games. Yeah, it is almost a new type of theatrical performance. It's a different one in its sense, but like anytime you watch someone have that playthrough, there's a different experience that you're not going to get the next time you do it.
Yeah.
And that's essentially what the theater is every performance. It'll be most likely largely the same, but with that live audience, or be it, you know, a streamed digital audience like on, you know, platforms like Twitch or YouTube.
Yeah, that's a great differential between theater and filmmaking also, because you're getting variety and there's still possibility for difference in going to a performance live.
Yeah.
Whereas when you watch a show, it's almost purely from an analytical standpoint because it isn't going to differentiate over time. And
I think that, you know, holds more true to make sure you keep that promise between you, the creator, and, you know, your audience. And it's nothing, and like I was saying before, it's nothing new, you know, that Chekhov was talking about. It's been around, you know, for as long as storytelling as we can think of. You know, if you look at Gilgamesh, for example, arguably the oldest, one of the oldest known written works in human civilization, you know, written somewhere around, you know, 2100 BC, somewhere around that time. There's essentially that concept of we're gonna tell a story, we're gonna set stuff up, and we're gonna pay it off at the end in some way. It might not pay off in the way you expected, but it's gonna be there. I don't know if anyone knows Gilgamesh off the top of their head or by heart.
I mean, not by heart off the head, but it's definitely a fascinating story, and I think worth looking into.
Yeah, and essentially, you know, the character of Gilgamesh is, you know, the king of Uruk at the time during early, you know, we're talking like the early Babylonian Sumerian civilization. I could be wrong in what ancient civilization he's attributed to, but we're talking
Dogs
the early
and cats living together,
mass hysteria. But we're referring to like, you know, the earliest civilizations. You know, essentially when the story is set up, he's this powerful king of his city, and he's also like, you know, back then, you know, there was always like the idea that the main character had to be part god and part man. So he was like, you know, I think that there's like this thing where some parts of the story, and I should also say that the story has been, you know, there's different retellings and versions of it. Some details can change a little bit, and I don't think they've ever truly found all of it. I'm not sure about that. like because it was written in cuneiform on like clay tablets back in the day. So I don't know if they have all of it preserved. That I'm not sure about. No one get mad at me if I'm wrong on that. Please don't. But yeah, essentially he's the king of Uruk, and he's part god, part man. But he's a horrible human being. He just is oppressive to his people. It has way too many sexual advances on women. Yeah,
that's for sure.
So it would definitely be a hard movie or story to tell, I think. In today's world, you'd have to be a little bit more conscientious of what you're doing. But essentially, the people of the city are essentially so fed up with him that they, ask the gods that can they do something? Can they change him? Can they make this better? And so the gods agree that okay, we'll create a way to stop him. So they create another man. I always pronounce the name wrong. I think it's Enkidu, I think is the way that you pronounce it. I'm not 100% sure on the pronunciation. And they create him in order to stop Gilgamesh, or at least they create him to be his equal. And the journey that they go on together, essentially that first act with the people of the city, asking the gods to, save them ultimately from Gilgamesh, they essentially give the people of Uruk a promise that, okay, we'll take care of it. And in the end, I don't not to give away the spoilers. I don't know. I mean, it's been around for 4,000 years, but spoilers.
Yeah, I think people will be okay.
Spoilers. So there's a lot of different. The story is long. It's an epic poem essentially, and there's a lot of different journeys and quests that Gilgamesh and Enkidu go on and take together. But one of the main ones, and you could argue each quest is sort of a different stage of life that you go through. One of the main ones, though, is that Enkidu actually ends up dying, and Gilgamesh is so like distraught over this that he's so fearful of death now that he wants to try and find a way to live forever. So he goes on a journey to, find immortality, and he ends up meeting, eventually he has to go and talk to the Sumerian equivalent of Noah in the story. The name, I forget the name. It's a very long name. It starts with a U, I think. I can't pronounce it. Might have to look it up. But when he meets the Noah of this story, he tells him that, well, if you want, he gives him a test. He says, well, surely if you want to live forever, then you can stay awake for 1 week. And says, if you can do that, I'll share with you the secret of immortality.
Which I'm sure many of us know the struggles of trying to stretch a sleep schedule.
Yes. Yeah. I mean,
it's not a pretty situation.
Yeah. Trying to stay awake for 1 day is horrible enough.
I tried to stay up for 36 hours last week. It didn't end well.
Oh, no. What kept you up for that long?
Oh, a little series called Dark, which I'll get into in a later episode. That's a whole thing.
That'll definitely have to be a whole thing. But yeah, no, essentially Gilgamesh was, given that task. If you can stay awake for a week, you'll be given immortality. Well, he fails it and has to sort of like come to grips with, the human condition and the inevitability of death. But it's meant to be taken in a positive way.
Yeah.
And it is meant to show that, to appreciate, the richness of the present rather than concerning too much with past or future. And then upon that, he returns to the city, to Uruk, as king, but he's a completely changed individual. And he stops being, oppressive to the people, stops forcing himself on people, which is a good thing.
And I think that's one of the most important things to any story or character arc is showing real, genuine change.
Yeah. And for me, it just calls into what Chekhov was talking about with his Chekhov's gun. We look at it as a use for like an object or a prop. That's the main modern, I think, example of it.
That tends to be the gravitas where it's explained and focused. Yeah.
Yeah. But I think you can look at it in a broader sense in that it's talking about a promise that you have, and like the promise that the gods gave in the story of Gilgamesh to help the people of the city and stop him. It is paid off in the end, but paid off maybe not in the way you thought. Like, Gilgamesh is the one who is still alive, still living. But when he comes back to the city, he is eventually a very different person and would be considered a more just ruler than what he was prior. So there was that setup, that contract stating that by the end of this story, Gilgamesh will have been dealt with in some way.
Yeah.
So I just think, it's nothing. It just harkens to how old this concept is.
I think could be said that it's just one of those universally accepted principles in storytelling that can be used for great benefit, and if you truly understand it, it can really, really improve your writing.
Yeah, and I think that's one thing to always look at when you're doing any type of story is that promise, you're going to give to the reader or the audience, whatever you're writing, going in knowing that. And it's also having an idea of knowing who you're writing for.
Yeah, and it also forces you to think in the terms that everything I'm putting in here should have some level of importance.
Yeah.
And it's the basic principle, you just don't waste your audience's time.
Exactly.
With stuff that doesn't matter.
And it doesn't always have to be...
And it's also, and in terms of like filmmaking and being the most forefront, I think, is just not to waste the resources of what you're working with.
Oh, yeah, especially during filmmaking and TV, because you're well on the clock there, and a lot of money...
Financially for multiple people in many cases.
Yeah, and a lot of people have poured resources and money into that. So yeah, you've got to make sure that whatever we're filming and whatever we're putting up on that screen is going to have a reason, even if the reason is simply to help with setting and, the mood of a story.
Or the simplicity of a joke and levity and getting your audience to laugh.
Yeah, and it can even be character building for the audience as well.
Yeah.
And I think that's always some things that, when you look at ones that like break it, the Chekhov's gun, it can leave like that sort of bitter, sour taste in your mouth. Like when you see it, you're like,
Yeah, it seems like even lately there's been more and more examples of this too.
Yeah, one that I can think of, and this is just off the top of my head, going on now a year ago. God, is it a year ago already? Oh God, is Game of Thrones. And how there was a little bit of that fallout. I feel like we're getting into this way later.
This is that age-old term of undermining your audience's expectations.
Yeah, that subverting of expectations. I think the reason that I know for me, I wasn't too. One, there could be the whole behind the scenes stuff that we don't know was going on. Who knows? Maybe there's been talk.
There's definitely a lot between R.R. Martin, Payoff, and Weiss.
Yeah,
that went on behind the curtain. That's fascinating to look at on the surface.
Yeah, from what I can tell, it seems that they Martin and even HBO were like, hey, we can go a couple more seasons, but I guess Benioff and Weiss were kind of, now we just want to end it.
They
here.
wanted their Netflix deal. So they wanted it.
So I mean, I want my Netflix deal.
Where's my Netflix deal?
But I just, regardless of that, I think when you look at
all that stuff to the side.
When you look at the ending, and one thing that I'll put into play there is
talking about it in non-spoilerific terminology. I would say that you have all this character build-up and all these two main threads that lead all the way to the very end of the story that essentially crisscross one another and land opposite of one another. And it's like your audience is just sitting there going, "This is so unsatisfactory. This is not what I've been building up to for 8 straight years," and I just feel almost betrayed by the story in a very strange way.
It's essentially, and I think it calls into the idea of the more significance you start to give something, you better make sure you're going to pay it off well. So you're
going to lead your audience down a path you don't want them to go.
If you compare it to Rush Hour example of Chris Tucker and the money in there, which has been used before, but something like that, if you didn't set it up and that's how he survived, you'd be like, oh, okay, well, that was, it would still break the Chekhov's gun law, but I don't know if it would ruin the movie for me if that one little thing there, because it was such a small, contained little incident.
Yeah.
Or likewise, if you have the money, show it, and then it never comes back into play, again, you could be like...
You're left wondering, well,
what was that about? But again, for me, if they did do it that way, I don't think it would have a greater effect on the story as a whole.
I think it's easier to deal with in a movie than it is to deal with in
an epic TV show. Yeah, no, I think,
series.
And that's one thing I think Chekhov's gun applies heavily, even more so, to a series, be it a book series or a TV series, because you have this long running narrative, especially if you're going to do a serial like Game of Thrones is, where every episode leads into the next. You can get away with it more in episodic terms,
but you have this building momentum for years and years,
and I think
it's you have to stick that landing or you're gonna make a lot of enemies.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's, without having too much spoilers, I think if you look at Jon Snow's story, so much emphasis is given to it, in every season. And then I think when you get to the end, the payoff seems a little strange, if you will.
And it's not a bad thing to go somewhere you didn't expect, but it does have to have some sort of impact, which it has to go somewhere.
Yeah. No.
I think just run the train off the end of the tracks.
I think it just gives you the idea in the sense that, okay, it goes back to what I was saying, like if you're going to break the rule or if you're going to try and use it in a different way, you want to make sure that you understand why you're doing that and if it could work. Just, or the exception, or accept the fact that if I do this, it could potentially have not the best results or not the results I'm looking for.
Exactly.
It's a good measuring tool, measuring stick, that anytime if you're going to, Chekhov's gun is a good way to gauge your story and sort of, again, that promise, that contract, that acceptance of audience and reader as co-creator of your world, because they're bringing something to it that, as any creative type, you're not going to be able to always foresee. You're never going to be able to tell how anyone is going to react to any story.
Yeah, it's you can focus group things to death, but it's you eventually just have to get in there and do it.
Yeah, and you're never going to win. I don't think there's ever been any story that's ever won everyone over. I'm sure everyone has likes, dislikes, loves, hates, and that's
because you get invested and you start looking forward, and your own imagination takes over, and your own expectations get formed, and then when things don't necessarily go the way that you thought they would, everybody thinks in chaotically random directions for the way they think things will go. So you can't align all that. It's impossible.
I think just what the main point of it is that it can be used as, just a tool to gauge how much of a good payoff you can expect or reaction from your audience or reader based on what you've set up and what you haven't, what you've paid off, what you didn't. And then also keeping in mind the payoff itself too. If I create something and I try to, this brings into the whole the red herring idea. If I create something in order to throw you off a trail, you got to be careful with that, because it can sometimes, as it did in my opinion in Game of Thrones, there was such a buildup with Jon's story, and essentially you kept nodding to what was going to happen.
Yeah, I think another good example to bring up too is J.J. Abrams and Damon Lindelof's Lost, which I think everybody on the planet was watching at the time, got into these crazy what the hell moments almost like the end of every episode, and they keep stringing along these crazy questions and these mysteries building up over long periods of time. They played with people's imaginations and emotions so much, I think that almost nothing they did was going to fully satisfy everybody.
And I think one of the things sort of breaks the rule there is, you have certain aspects. For example, I think I can remember the voices that people would hear in the jungle at night, and then it's not fully explained until the very last season, and it's kind of a quick explanation,
Yeah, and they also would do things that you would think that these random voices would be the others that they have built up, and it turns out that that's not even remotely the case.
Yeah, no, it's
when you think it's almost like you went down these. I personally went down these spirals of thinking I had the explanation for things, and then getting them spun in a completely different direction, and then by the end of the series, I feel like I don't know anything that's going on, and it's just a confusing mess.
And I think also too, there was a lot of stuff, the first season that was set up and then doesn't really get paid off until the end. And again, this brings up the idea the more attention you give something and the longer that you're holding off on telling us what it is, it gives it that more significance.
Yeah, it has a higher weight to it, and you the harder it's going to be. And if you can do it, all the more power to you. But you really have to stick that landing.
Yeah, exactly. So and that I think whereas the voices, the smoke monster, I'm trying to think of some of the other ones.
There were so many great things in that series.
Yeah, and
it went to so many fascinating and interesting places, and it touched on so many other types of storytelling. It has the Jurassic Park vibe draw. It has the mysterious island is just in so many different kinds of storytelling. It's just that's just a great topic and a great place to start working with. And they had the Bermuda Triangle vibe of all these different crashes and things pulled in, so many great inherent pieces of storytelling in Henry Gale's balloon and all these random crazy things in one spot. It's such a great place to start.
Yeah, and even like you mentioned, the island itself.
Yeah, it's the island itself is a mystery.
Yeah, and which I guess you could, and it's still a mystery at the end. I guess you could, you can always keep it that way. It's there's nothing wrong there, but I think it's just showing you that there is sort of that, this for that type mentality with using Chekhov's gun. Like it's like I said, it's a tool and a way to gauge how well and what you can maybe expect based on what you've set up and how long you've taken to pay it off or not pay it off, or pay it off in a way that is different, but maybe contrary to what you might have been going for.
I think it's become very essential to TV, I think, among obviously in everything, but I think it's become most important in TV because you have these long-standing threads that people want paid off.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So, like, over these years, people get invested in these things, and then they want to see these little moments and these little things come to fruition and actually take effect. And a good writer can take those things and fold one plant and payoff into the next, into the next, into the next. And I think a good example of that is the Back to the Future trilogy, and it does this very, very efficiently. Even though that was never actually planned to be a trilogy from its initial creation.
It wasn't planned to be a trilogy from the beginning?
No, it was initial. Like the whole moment at the end of the first one, I think has been openly admitted as just being just a joke to, to be a nice send off.
I never knew that. Okay,
it was a comedy.
Yeah. No, that makes sense.
But after it exploded and became this huge global phenomenon, they really went for it, and they folded it into this great storyline. And it's obviously, again, spoilers if you haven't seen the 40-year-old franchise of Back to the Future. Obviously, cut away now. But they plant with the almanac. And Marty has this dark thought of, I can make a quick buck.
Yeah.
And he folds that into, Doc takes him and throws away the book and says, that's a bad thing, don't do that. But then that turns into Biff hearing this whole crazy thought go into play, and then we get this whole tangential alternate reality where Biff has become this huge mogul billionaire and has taken over the world. And then they manage to nullify all this and get the almanac and erase it, but in the process of doing that, they've now created this whole other thread, which becomes the entire third movie.
Yeah.
And they plant and pay these things off along the way so beautifully, and it's just this huge patchwork of restructuring everything and planting and paying off that the whole thing is based around that.
Yeah. No, absolutely. Like, I mean, if you look at especially the second and third movie, they are essentially, those two are working off of each other more so, and that makes sense now because I never knew that it was originally only meant to be the one, and then the other two kind of came later.
And I think that's largely, like, a lot of trilogies ended up being that way. That's why like, usually the first one is like its own
standalone
deal,
yeah.
And the two following tend to be intertwined in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
Because once they see it's successful, they okay, we'll do this whole big thing here.
Yeah, and that, again, the bigger the scope of the story, the longer you want something to go before you pay it off, the more you have to accept, I got to pay this off right. The more weight, I think you had mentioned before, that payoff is going to carry. So for, like you said, the almanac in the second one, that's essentially one of the, top driving forces of part two. And I think there's even another a little setup and payoff that is played on Marty when he's trying to get the almanac back, and then Biff switches it when he's in because he goes to Strickland's office and he thinks it's there, but it actually turns out to be, I think it's just like a porn magazine that he's looking at or something. But he switched
just like a pinup girls movie.
Yeah, and he switched the dust jacket off of it.
Yeah, and it's this great little misdirect.
Yeah.
That you as an audience member are sitting there thinking, oh yeah, he's finally got it back, and then it's a quick reversal. Oh no.
So yeah, it's a good use of, once again, quick setup, paid off, and used to propel the story forward again, and raise the stakes, raise the jeopardy of it, heighten the tension. So it can be used on the smallest level, Chekhov's gun, and you can even take it to the highest level of storytelling, and that's
you have these grandiose implications for every situation involved in your story, or it can be as simple as just a dumb joke to make you laugh.
Yeah, and that's So I think that's what's great about it, is when you really look into it, it kind of is like an umbrella that goes over storytelling completely in terms of ways to make something work. It's one of both the biggest and smallest ways you can expand your story, which is what's, I think, so cool about it. Yeah. And to get an idea of, what's going to happen when someone reads a story. You're not always going to know how someone's going to react, but you can certainly get a better idea of how it might go down by using this tool and understanding it and how it works.
So yeah, I think that's Chekhov's gun for us. It's a pretty darn cool concept, and I mean, anybody who's looking to write a story, it's definitely worth researching.
Yeah, and just something essential, I think, and an essential tool for your toolbox as any creator or writer when it comes to storytelling, specifically. That learn, master, and if you want to break it, make sure that you understand why you're doing that in the first place.
And make sure that it's, like, again, for a purpose. Like, don't ever just do something to do something.
Yeah.
It's like the more purpose something has, the more effect it can have.
Exactly.
But yeah, I think as we go forward, we're gonna touch on a lot of these kind of topics, and hopefully, like, anybody who's looking to get into either as simply as just playing a D&D round and wants to craft a cool campaign, or anybody who wants to write a script or come up with an idea or how to find a better way to do something.
Yeah, or ways to shoot those scripts.
Yeah, I kind of want to find a medium for helping people and generate conversations, talk with people, get some information flowing. So yeah, look forward to more of this, and we'll see you guys next time.
Take care, everyone.
No. Oh, there it is.
Loud.